Hi. Well, I've come to a decision on what I want to do, and my daughter, she's in second grade. Her name's Bailey, and right now she's got an assignment that either she reads to herself every night for, I think it's a minimum of 15 minutes, or somebody else reads to her. So for the past week now, I've been reading to my daughter, and I have thoroughly enjoyed it. She is loving it. We are actually reading currently right now the Ranger's Apprentice by John Flanagan. It is a book series right now. I think currently there's either 12 or 13 books in this series. And it's something that I was thinking about that really I'm not the greatest of readers. Uh, Neither is she, being second grade. But I think it's something that before I've never really given it much thought. I've never really spent enough time on actually sitting down with her and spending time with her and reading stories, which I really feel kind of guilty about. And I know there are other parents out there just as busy. You know, they've got a lot on their plates right now. That they just don't have enough time to sit down and read to children, or there are people out there that like to hear about new and interesting books. So I think what I really want to do is I want to create a series based upon books that I have read. I'm a big reader. I like to read. I just can't do it out loud very well. But these are books that I enjoy, and I like rereading the same books. I'd like to pass on a bunch of books to my daughter as she gets older. I would really like to see her, I like seeing her imagination flourish. Um, so I would really like to take it on and see how far I can take this. Like I said, it's a 12, 13 book series. So I mean, this could be something that goes on farther, and if it's something that parents out there would think would be interesting, please let me know. So without further ado, I'm going to read you the first chapter of The Ranger's Apprentice, Book 1 of the series, The Ruins of Gorlan. Chapter 1. Try to eat something, Will. Tomorrow's a big day, after all. Jenny, blonde, pretty, and cheerful, gestured towards Will's barely touched plate and smiled encouragingly at him. Will made it an attempt to return the smile, but it was a dismal failure. He picked at the plate before him, piled high with his favorite foods. Tonight, his stomach knotted tight with tensions and anticipation. He could hardly bring himself to swallow a bite. Tomorrow would be a big day, he knew. He knew it all too well, in fact. Tomorrow would be the biggest day of his life, because tomorrow was choosing day, and it would determine how he would spend the rest of his life. Nerves, I imagine, said George, settling down his loaded fort and seizing the lapels of his jacket in a judicious manner. He was thin, gangly, and studious boy, fascinated by rules and regulations, with a penchant for examining and debating both sides of any question, sometimes at great length. Dreadful things, nervousness. It can just freeze you up so you can't think, can't eat, can't speak. I'm not nervous, Will said quietly, noticing that Horace had looked up, ready to form a sarcastic comment. George nodded several times, considering Will's statement. On the other hand, he added, a little nervousness can actually improve performance. It can heighten your perception and sharpen your reactions. So, the fact that you are worried, in fact, if you are, is not necessarily something to be worried about of itself, so to speak. In spite of himself, a wry smile touched Will's mouth. George would be a natural in the legal profession, he thought. He would almost certainly be the scribe master's choice in the following morning. Perhaps, Will thought, that was the heart of his own problem. He was the only one of his ward mates who had any fear about the choosing that would take place within 12 hours. He ought to be nervous, Horace scoffed. After all, which craftmaster is going to want him as an apprentice? I'm sure we're all nervous, Alice said. She directed one of her rare smiles at Will. We'd be stupid not to be. Well, I'm not, Horace said, then reddened as Alice raised one eyebrow, and Jenny giggled. It was typical of Alice, Will thought. He knew the tall, graceful girl had already been promised a place as an apprentice by Lady Pauline, head of Castle Redmont's diplomatic service. Her pretense that she was nervous about the following day, and her tact in refraining from pointing out Horace's gaffe, showed that she was already a diplomat of some skill. Jenny, of course, would gravitate immediately to the castle kitchens, domain of Master Chubb, Redmont's head chef. He was a man renowned throughout the kingdom for his banquet services in the castle's massive dining halls. Jenny loved food and cooking, and her easygoing nature and unfailing good humor would make her an invaluable staff member in the turmoil of the castle kitchens. Battle school would be Horace's choice. Will glanced at his wardmate now, hungrily tucking into his roast turkey, ham and potatoes, that he had heaped onto his plate. Horace was big for his age and a natural athlete. The chances that he would be refused were virtually non-existent. Horace was exactly the type of recruit Sir Rodney looked for in his warrior apprentices. Strong, athletic, fit, and though Will thought trifling sourly, not too bright. Battle school was a path to knighthood for boys like Horace, born commoners, but with the physical abilities to serve as knights in the kingdom. Which left Will. What would his choice be? More importantly, as Horace had pointed out, which craftmaster would accept him as an apprentice? For choosing day was a pivotal point in the life in the castle wards. They were orphan children raised by the generosity of Baron Errold, the Lord of Redmont's fief. For the most part, their parents had died in the service of the fief, and the Baron saw it as his responsibility to care for and raise the children of his former subjects, and to give them an opportunity to improve their station in life wherever possible. Choosing day provided that opportunity. Each year, castle wards that were turning 15 could apply to be apprentice to the masters of the various crafts that served the castle and its people. Ordinarily, craft apprentices were selected by dint of their parents' occupation or influences with the craftmasters. The castle wards usually had no such influence, and this was their chance to win a future for themselves. Those wards who weren't chosen, or whom no openings could be found, would be assigned to the farming families in the nearby village, providing farm labor to raise the crop and animals that fed the castle inhabitants. It was rare for this to happen, Will knew. The Baron and his craftmasters usually went out of their way to fit the ward into one craft or another. But it could happen, and it was a fate he feared more than anything. Horace caught his eyes now and gave him a smug smile. "Still planning on applying for battle school, Will?" he asked, through a mouthful of turkey and potatoes. "Better eat something, then. You'll need to build yourself up a little." He snorted with laughter, and Will glared at him. A few weeks previously, Horace had overheard Will confiding in Alice that he desperately wanted to be selected for battle school, and he had made Will's life a misery ever since, pointing out on every possible occasion that Will's slight build was totally unsuited for the rigors of battle school training. The fact that Horace was probably right only made matters worse. Where Horace was tall and muscular, Will was small and wiry. He was agile and fast and surprisingly strong, but he simply didn't have the size that he knew was required of battle school apprentices. He hoped against hope for the past few years that he would have what people called a growth spurt before the choosing day came around. But it had never happened, and now the day was nearly here. As Will said nothing, Horace sensed that he had scored a verbal hit. This was a rarity in their turbulent relationship. Over the past few years, he and Will had clashed repeatedly. Being the stronger of the two, Horace usually got the better of Will. Although very occasionally, Will's speed and agility allowed him to get in a surprise kick or punch, and then escape before Horace could catch him. But while Horace generally had the best of their physical clashes, it was unusual for him to win any of their verbal encounters. Will's wit was as agile as the rest of him, and he almost always managed to have the last word. In fact, it was this tenacity that often led to trouble between them. Will was yet to learn that having the last word was not always a good idea. Horace decided now to press his advantage. "You need muscles to get into battle school, Will. Real muscles," he said, glancing at the others around the table to see if anyone disagreed. The other wards, uncomfortably at the growing tensions between the two boys, concentrated on their own. "Particularly between the ears," Will replied, and unfortunately Jenny couldn't refrain from giggling. Horace's face flushed, and he started to rise from his seat. But Will was quicker, and he was already at the door before Horace could disentangle himself from the chair. He contented himself with hurling a final insult after his retreating wardmate. "That's right, run away, Will No Name. You're a no-name, and nobody will want you as an apprentice." In the anteroom outside, Will heard the parting sally and felt blood flush to his cheeks. It was the taunt he hated most, although he tried never to let Horace know that, sensing that he would provide the bigger boy with a weapon if he did. The truth was, nobody knew Will's second name. Nobody knew who his parents had been. Unlike his year-mates, who had lived in the fief before their parents had died and whose histories were known, Will had appeared virtually out of nowhere as a newborn baby. He had been found wrapped in a small blanket and placed in a basket on the steps of the ward building 15 years ago. A note had been attached to the blanket, reading simply, "His mother died in childbirth. His father died a hero. Please care for him. His name is Will." That year, there had only been one other ward. Alyssa's father was a cavalry lieutenant who had died in the Battle of Hackham Heath when Morgarath's Wargle army had been defeated and driven back to the mountains. Alyssa's mother, devastated by her loss, succumbed to a fever some weeks after giving birth. So there was plenty of room in the ward for the unknown child, and Baron Errold was at heart a kindly man. Even though the circumstances were unusual, he had given permission for Will to be accepted as a ward of the Castle Redmont. It seemed logical to assume that, if the note were true, Will's father had died in the war against Morgarath, and since Baron Errold had taken a leading part in that war, he felt it duty-bound to honor the unknown father's sacrifice. So Will had become a Redmont ward, raised and educated by the Baron's generosity. As time passed, the others had gradually joined him and until there were 5 in their year group. But while the others had memories of their parents, or in Alyssa's case, people who had known them and could tell her about them, Will knew nothing of his past. This was why he had invented the story that had sustained him through his childhood in the war, and, as the years passed, he had added detail and color to the story. He eventually came to believe it himself. His father, he knew, had died a hero's death, so it made sense to create a picture of him as a hero, a knight warrior in full armor, fighting against the Wargle horde, cutting them down left and right until eventually he was overcome by sheer weight of numbers. Will had pictured the tall figure so often in his mind, seeing every detail of his armor and equipment, but never being able to visualize his face. As a warrior, his father would expect him to follow in his footsteps. This was why selection for battle school was so important to Will, and that was why the more unlikely it became that he would be selected, the more desperately he clung to the hope that he might be. He exited the ward building into the darkened castle yard. The sun was long down, and the torches placed every 20 meters or so on the castle walls shed a flickering, uneven light. He hesitated a moment. He would not return to the ward and face Horace's continued taunts. To do so would only lead to another fight between them, a fight that Will knew that he would probably lose. George would probably try to analyze the situation for him, looking at both sides of the question and thoroughly confusing the issue. Alyssa and Jenny might try to comfort him, he knew. Alyssa, particularly since they had grown up together. But at the moment, he didn't want their sympathy, and he couldn't face Horace's taunts. So he headed for the one place he knew he could find solitude. The huge fig tree growing close by the castle's central tower had often afforded him a haven. Height was no fear for Will, and he climbed smoothly into the tree, continuing long after another might have stopped, until he was at the lighter branches at the very top. Branches that swayed and dipped under his weight. In the past, he had often escaped from Horace up here. The bigger boy couldn't match Will's speed in the tree, and he was unwilling to follow as high as this. Will found a convenient fork and wedged himself into it, his body giving slightly to the movement of the trees as the branches swayed in the evening breeze. Below, the foreshortened figures of the watch made their rounds in the castle yard. He heard the door of the ward building open, and glancing down, saw Alyssa emerge, looking around the yard for him in vain. The tall girl hesitated a few moments, then, seemingly to shrug, turned back inside. The elongated rectangle of light that the open door threw across the yard was cut off as she closed the door softly behind her. Strange, he thought, how seldom people tend to look up. There was a rustle of soft feathers, and a barn owl landed on the next branch, its head swiveling, its huge eyes catching every last ray of faint light. It studied him without concern, seeming to know it had nothing to fear from him. It was a hunter, a silent flyer, a ruler of the night. "At least you know who you are," he said softly to the bird. It swiveled its head again, then launched itself off into the darkness, leaving him alone with his thoughts. Gradually, as he sat there, the lights of the castle windows went out, one by one. The torches burnt down to smoldering husks, and were replaced at midnight by the change of the watch. Eventually, there was only one light left burning, and that, he knew, was in the Baron's study, when the Lord of Redmont was still presumably at work, poring over reports and papers. The study was virtually level with Will's position in the tree, and he could see the burly figure in the Baron's seat at his desk. Finally, Baron Errol rose, stretched, and leaned forward to extinguish the lamp as he left the room. heading for his sleeping quarters on the floor above. Now the castle was asleep, except for the guards on the walls, who kept constant watch. In less than 9 hours, Will realized he would face the choosing. Silently, miserably, fearing the worst, he climbed down from the tree and made his way to his bed in the darkened boys' dormitory of the ward. And that ends chapter 1. I hope you enjoyed it. Please stay tuned for the next chapter. I will upload it as soon as possible. I'm hoping tomorrow I'll be able to get it uploaded. I hope you enjoyed, and if you have any comments or suggestions, please leave them in the comments below. Thank you.